my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable and far better than that of our ancestors at the boundary of the promised land. Amen. The people of Israel got into trouble in the wilderness because of stinking thinking. They had inappropriate attitudes which festered and affected their actions towards God. We need to make sure that we don't do the same thing. Psalm 73 is all about an attitude check. We will be using the psalm to both diagnose what goes wrong when attitudes become badditudes, and to prescribe a cure for this attitudinal ailment. So let's see. I'm going to hope that there it goes. By the end of our lesson, we will be equipped to recognize danger signals and to treat attitude sickness, not altitude sickness. This is attitude sickness when it rises within us. At the beginning of the psalm, the psalmist is envious of the wicked and feeling sorry for himself. He is having a pity party and is also complaining about how God has failed to come through for him and seems to show more favor to the wicked. It's not wrong to have a faith crisis. However, it is wrong to fail to learn from faith crises, and foolish not to seek to resolve them. It is right for believers to seek help from others in the family of God and to find mutual benefit from one another's experiences. Notice Asaph's candor as he relates the saga of his spiritual crisis and recovery. The experience may be likened to a bout of spiritual sickness, a fever, and it's outlined in 3 broad sections. In verses 1 to 3, the psalmist describes the primary symptom of his spiritual illness. The primary symptom is envy. He states that despite God's faithful goodness, his own feet were almost gone. His steps had almost slipped, for he was envious of the foolish when he saw the prosperity of the wicked. Contemplating the creature comforts of the wicked can create spiritual problems for us. Well, let me move myself up here so you see more of me here. Okay. It can create spiritual problems for us. Truly, this problem of envying the wicked is a common one. In this world, there is a constant tension between what we see and what we are called upon to believe. It's not that what we believe isn't true or real, but there are many areas where we are called to walk by faith and not by sight, and the sights with which we must contend often seem to contradict our faith, don't they? Verses 4 to 11 describe what caused Asaph to stumble in his walk of faith. He saw the wicked as apparently prosperous in their wickedness, comfortable and proud, their tongues strutting throughout the earth, as he says. Their lives appeared better and easier than the lives of the righteous. Despite their arrogance, God mysteriously seemed to spare them from judgment and give them increase. He gave them increase. They were prosperous. From this, the psalmist concludes that the final word on the ungodly is success. They, quote, prosper in the world. They increase in riches. That's in verse 12. While the final word on the godly is futility. He says, truly, I have cleansed my heart in vain and washed my hands in innocence. Asaph's faith crisis is characterized by observational difficulties that led to a generalized and exaggerated misperception. The psychological discipline called cognitive therapy teaches us that depression can and often is caused by distorted thinking. Pioneers in this field, such as David Burns, and I've read his seminal book, Feeling Good, speak of common motifs in distorted thinking. This is what gets you depressed. So listen up, folks. One of these is overgeneralization, such as seeing a single negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. Another distortion is what they call mental filter, picking out a single negative detail and dwelling on it exclusively so that your vision of the rest of reality becomes darkened. You become hyper-focused on some problem and it just sucks you in. I know that territory very well. Many of you do too. A third is absolutism, or all or nothing thinking, perceiving issues entirely in black and white categories. If I'm not a screaming success, I'm a complete failure. That's the way we are. And all of these distorted viewpoints are portrayed in the writings of the psalmist, who complained, quote, all day long I have been plagued and chastened every morning. That's verse 14. That's distorted thinking. All day long, Asaph? Every morning, Asaph? Considered in this light, one can begin to discern something of the nature of the malady, this faith sickness, from which the psalmist suffered. Let's give you another panel. Hold it a second. You can begin to see something of the nature of this attitude sickness, this faith sickness from which the psalmist suffered. It is primarily a distortion in perspective. This is indicated right at the outset. At the very beginning of the psalmist says, truly, God is good to Israel, even to such as of a clean heart. But as for me, my feet were almost gone, my steps had almost slipped. In other words, he's saying, even though God is good to Israel, I lost sight of that, and I focused instead upon those things which I perceived to be reality, and those distorted and limited perceptions upset my life of faith and worship. This is for you guys. All of us walk this path sometimes. Some of us walk it all the time. In every fever, there is a point at which the fever breaks, indicating that the crisis is over. So note the evidence that the psalmist was pulling out of his delirium and coming to his senses. Notice also, we'll look at it, the steps he took to get well and keep the steps he took to get well and to keep from infecting other people. First, he sensed that he was sick and was careful not to spread the contagion. So should we all be. If I say, he says, if I say, I will speak thus out of my sour attitude and resentful attitude, as in verses 1 to 14, if I spoke like this, I would offend against the generation of your children, God. I would cause people to become infected with this I was going to use the term pus of this wound of mine. If I spoke about it, if I blabbed my mouth about it, I would infect other people. Secondly, he pondered to understand this. He sought to diagnose his problem. So should we. Rather than wallow in our crisis, we should try to figure out what's going on here. He says, when I thought to know this, it was too difficult for me. So number three, he sought for expert advice. He says, I went into the sanctuaries of God, and then I understood. Then I understood what was really going to happen to the wicked. I went to the experts. I went to the source of truth. I went to a place where the air was pure, the air of truth. And then I understood. Going to the sanctuary involved going not only to the place of worship, but also to the place of instruction. Often, especially in times of crisis, believers need to call upon spiritually astute friends and call upon others for insight and objectivity, which they may not be able to discover on their own. Sometimes our hearts are so broken, our minds are so clouded, that we need a reality check from other people. And that's not weakness, that's wisdom. Wisdom. Number four, he took care of his diet of worship. When you're getting well, you improve your diet. He improved his diet. He participated in public worship even though he was feeling spiritually sick. When people go into a spiritual tailspin, they often make matters worse by absenting themselves from the public worship of God. They say, I don't feel like going to synagogue. And that may be 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And the longer it lasts, the worse it gets. This only serves to worsen the situation. But he was smart. He improved his diet. He went to the sanctuary. Through seeking instruction, through participating in worship, through the jolting of his consciousness, which came from going to that familiar and holy place, he had his perception corrected and restored. That's really good news. You know, he got well. In these verses, the psalmist tells the symptoms not only of his illness, but of his restored health. And here they are. He restored his perception of the actual state of the wicked. He saw that contrary to appearances, their feet actually were set in slippery places. Their apparent security is just a move away from tumbling into the righteous judgment of God. These wicked, who seemed so secure and impervious to harm, will in the end prove to have been as temporary and insubstantial as a dream that one remembers upon awakening. It'll all go away. It's terrific, isn't it? It's really terrific. Secondly, his restored perception of how spiritually sick he had been. He had clarity on the state of the wicked. He had clarity on how sick he had been. Verse 21 and 22. Contrary to his former protestations of being innocent and righteous, he now recognizes that while he was in the grip of his envy, he had been foolish, ignorant, brutalized, like a beast before God in his spiritual insensitivities. Number three, he has restored recognition of the blessedness of being a servant of God. Before, he viewed himself as an innocent sufferer who was getting nothing but abuse and deprivation for his righteous pains. That's a terrible way to think. But that was him. Thank God that he confessed this, because we get the benefit. Now he saw that he had been and always would be a blessed man because of God's constant grace and goodness. He says, quote, nevertheless, despite all my beastliness, I am continually with thee. You have held me by my right hand. You will guide me with your counsel, and afterward you'll receive me into glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And there's nothing on earth that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail. And as a guy who's getting older, I really paid attention to those words. Yes, my flesh and my heart may fail. They will. But God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. I don't know about you folks, but this stuff is beautiful. Concerning the wicked, they are surely not to be envied. He says, uh, for lo, those who are far from you shall perish. You have destroyed all those who play the harlot departing from you. Verse 27. Concerning the righteous, they are never to be pitied, as was the psalmist's viewpoint when he was vexed in his own heart. On the contrary, he says, it is good for me to draw near to God. I have put my trust in the Lord that I might declare all your works. So, one more panel. After the psalmist comes to his senses, he lists some characteristics of restored health, restored attitudinal health, lessons to remember and apply. We would do well to instill these characteristics in ourselves and to keep them fresh. So here they are. This is what we take away from this extraordinary, life-giving lesson in Psalm 73. First, being troubled in our spiritual lives often involves losing perspective. Therefore, God's people must be on guard lest our perspective be distorted. As Yeshua said in the Sermon on the Mount, quote, the lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is healthy, your whole perspective will be full of light. But if your eye is evil, the whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? He's talking about perspective. Perspective has to do with seeing, how you see things. Secondly, there are certain kinds of statements a believer, you and me, we should not allow ourselves to make. The psalmist realized that while in the grip of his vexation, he was like a beast toward God. And that if he were to give vent to his vexation and his distorted ideas, he would create faith problems for others. He would spread the infection. We should always watch our mouth and not give voice to bitterness towards God in public, which might corrupt others. I just ran across somebody I've known for 40 years more on Facebook, who was spreading all kinds of complaint. It's terrible. It's not doing anybody any good, certainly not them. The writer to the Hebrews puts it this way: looking diligently, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and by it many become defiled. He says we should look diligently and prevent any root of bitterness that springs up among us from defiling many people. We have a responsibility not to infect others. Sometimes, number three, sometimes a believer needs to go outside of herself to find the diagnosis and input that will break the fever of spiritual sickness and its delusionary perspective. Just as the psalmist went to the temple and found renewed perspective there, we as believers ought to depend upon wise friends and reliable teaching for reality checks. They will help to correct our distorted perceptions. A believer should never neglect established avenues of spiritual nurture, especially when she or he is spiritually sick. I know it's a temptation. I know it is. But you can always come and just sit there. Don't put on a happy face. Don't feel you have to be a phony. Just sit and soak up whatever you can. And very often there will be a special word waiting there for you from God that is going to be medicine to your bones. If there was one time for Asaph not to stay away from the temple, it was when he was experiencing spiritual problems. When spiritual malaise strikes, many reduce or eliminate participation because, quote, they don't feel like going, end quote. That is just the time when you and I ought to go, when we don't feel like it. Believers, Yeshua's people, should monitor our attitudes towards God, lest we give way to brutish and insensitive attitude. Not only should we watch our mouths for the sake of others we know, we should watch our hearts for our own sake. As the writer to Proverbs put it, keep your heart with all diligence, for from it are the issues of life. You notice, keep your heart. Don't let your heart become overgrown with toxic weeds. You got to tend your heart. Like my wife, God bless her, she's in Idaho today with her brother. My wife works every day on the beautiful garden we have. We have a gorgeous garden, but it's not by accident. If you want your heart to be a beautiful garden, you have to tend it. Do it with all diligence. The basic prerequisite for worship of God and life with God is a deep and abiding sense of privilege. The basic enemy of worship is pride, an unwarranted sense of entitlement. The psalmist was a religious professional, yet by his own admission, there was a time when his heart was not right with God, a time when he was consumed with envy for the wicked on the one hand, and a sense of his own righteousness meriting better treatment on the other. But when at last his spiritual fever broke, then and when, like the prodigal son, he came to himself, he realized that he was not a victim, but a privileged servant of God. Believers who walk, you and I, when we walk in that sense of gratitude and privilege, we will be more likely to escape the kind of spiritual malaise that afflicted the psalmist, and we will think and live as servants of the King. Now, today's goal was this: to recognize and cure the disease, attitude sickness. I think Dr. Asaf filled the bill. He gave a great diagnosis and great advice for the cure. Blessed be Asaf's God, who is our God, who is the true and living God, whose word is like medicine to our bones, and who, despite all the problems we have and all of the stinking thinking that we have, will receive us into glory. Blessed be his name. Now, I've got a song